Kyle Wilhoit.
Hi.
Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
It's
Really
a pleasure.
appreciate it.
It's an honor having you here.
I appreciate that.
It's your first time in Norway?
First time to Norway.
Yeah.
It has been a deep pleasure. I've been in Trondheim, Oslo. It's been fantastic.
Nice.
Food's great.
Cool.
Culture's great. People are awesome. Public transport's fantastic.
Yeah. It's the first time I think I've heard somebody not mention that things are expensive when they're in Oslo.
The beers are expensive.
Yeah, yeah.
The food's a bit expensive, but again, I mean, inflation's high everywhere.
Yeah.
So, you know.
Usually people leave with that. Oh, it's so expensive here. But
Well, you know.
we ordered the best weather we could get for you at least.
It hasn't rained
So.
the entire week. It
Nice.
has gone against all of my expectations because I was expecting rain, kind of chilly.
Right.
And Trondheim was a bit chilly, but I haven't had any rain this whole week. It's been
Cool.
fantastic.
Well, awesome.
Yeah.
Welcome.
Thank you.
An extremely impressive background and career that you're bringing with us here today. All within our lovely world of cybersecurity. Let's see. You started off in insurance. You've been a professor.
Yeah.
IT security manager with an energy company.
Yep.
Threat research on Micro. Analyst in FireEye. A co-author of 2 books.
Yep.
One about ICS and SCADA and one about Operationalizing TI.
Yep.
Which we're going to talk about today.
Awesome.
Research on domain tools. I was listening to some of your old podcasts today at the gym.
Okay. I'm sorry.
It's so annoying. No, good content. It's really annoying that in YouTube you have to stay on their app. You can't
Yep.
I could just upgrade, but can't do that. Guest review board member at Black Cat.
Yep.
So you hear a lot of cool stuff, and
Yeah.
for the last 5.5 years, you've been at our beloved partner Palo Alto Networks.
That's correct. Yeah.
So just as a start, like what you've been up to there the past 5.5 years.
Oh boy. So I started at Palo Alto Networks actually as a principal level researcher, primarily focused on nation state espionage groups operating from Iran and kind of China, Russia, the typical kind of locations that you would associate with targeted attack groups.
Yeah.
And then slowly moved over into the leadership side. So now I'm actually the director of threat research, running cybercrime research as well as APT research underneath the Unit 42 Threat Intelligence team.
Awesome.
That's a lot to unpack, I know.
Yeah.
But Unit 42 Intelligence is basically a globally dispersed team of individuals that are focused on the collection, analysis, and production of threat intelligence and making sure that intelligence makes it back into our products and product protections. So I'm kind of responsible for making sure that the research that we generate within intelligence is making it into the products, making it into production, deliverable values such as reports, blogs, white papers, conference talks, those types of things. And then ultimately making sure all of that knowledge lives in one central repository for access and production of that data.
We were talking about how you see something and within a certain amount of minutes, it's you're implementing the learnings from that incident into your products
As quickly as possible,
Yeah.
as fast as possible. Now,
Yeah.
the complexity of the attack, the complexity of the style of attack, what they're using, what type of malware, exfiltration techniques, and everything in between will vary on how fast we can roll those detections out and depending on the product itself and where that lives in the stack. So if it's encrypted C2 communications, as an example, it would take a little bit longer lead time because we have to make sure the rules are soak tested and properly vetted and make sure that there's not any false positives, false negatives, that kind of stuff. So it just depends on how complex the attack is and what's involved with that. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Can you give me just a few examples? It's really cool, knowing that something happens. Is it from incident response that you're getting all these information, or is it actually from your products that
Really
are there?
good question.
Yeah.
A very informed question, frankly. So we really kind of tap into a couple different veins of data. One is our organic research. So my team specifically, we have about 12 folks on my team doing just research. And that's one vein of research. And we do kind of organic hunting. That's where we're looking through OSINT data or open source intelligence data. We're also looking at telemetry data, meaning packets and logs and generated logs that are created from our system from different areas that we can look into, looking for needles in haystacks. Right? That's one side. The other side is we have a team dedicated solely to embedding threat researchers and threat intelligence analysts into incident response cases. So every time an incident response case comes in, most of those cases get a threat researcher assigned to that, and they can help add that contextual information, maybe possible who this could be, who's behind this attack, what are common attributes, what else should these individuals be hunting for in this environment based on the TTPs or tactics, techniques, and procedures that these actors are using. So So we're using both of those veins of avenue. And then we also are very good on partnership agreements. We have another team in Unit 42 Intelligence that really works a lot with our law enforcement partners, Interpol being one of them as an example, and working on those partnership agreements to make sure that, we have good partnerships in place to be able to, give intelligence back and forth. So we really have kind of three specific unique veins that we kind of tap into to generate that intelligence data and to generate that intelligence, to contextualize intelligence.
Is that kind of how all or a lot of vendors would kind of work with it? If you had to generalize, like, obviously there's a bunch of different, but that's how intelligence is.
Yeah,
industry standard sort of.
It's a good question. It really kind of depends. So a product-based organization, a lot of the intelligence that's being generated typically from a product organization is looking to impact the products and looking to have an outreach function.
Yeah.
So they're looking to be able to make sure that our products are properly detecting, a new malware family that we're reverse engineering as an example. And then also at that same time, while we're looking at that data and we're kind of trying to understand it, we're also looking at how can that be leveraged from a production perspective. Can we put this into a blog? Would it make sense in a blog? How do we give this intelligence and this data to customers? How do we distribute that out, et cetera? So our primary avenue, and I kind of view this holistically as a product organization, those are two key deliverables for many product organizations. There may be others. One of our initial areas as well is making sure our executives are well informed from the intelligence perspective, what's going on across the threat landscape, what's happening in there. So another aspect of that is making sure executives understand that data, where to provide it, et cetera.
Cool.
There are aspects as well where, some product vendors want to create like a threat feed or something like that from the threat intelligence data that's being generated. We're not really playing in that field right now because we're really focused heavily on impacting the products and making sure products are detecting that activity that is typically bypassing, traditional security protections and signatures, those types of things. So we're looking really at the outliers. We're looking at the outliers that our products are not detecting out of the box with machine learning, with signatures, all of those things. And we're finding those gaps and making sure those protections are in place.
So you've seen the whole shift between like signature based over to like this.
Absolutely. Not only that, but it allows us for a unique viewpoint into how attackers change their tactics, techniques, and procedures over time. Because as we're tracking them, they're constantly modifying their tactics, their techniques, the procedures, the tooling, infrastructure, everything. And we track that over time. And that ultimately allows us to build a profile of that actor group. It allows us to ultimately also understand, can we project in the future what those attackers might do? So yeah, it's interesting.
So you're getting closer to that last thing you mentioned here. That's what your goal is.
Precisely. Yeah, precisely. And making sure we store all of that contextualized data in one central source that we can tap into in a litany of different ways.
Yeah. Cool. So that's a very good segue into the first thing I want to talk about today. So there's two overall things. One of them is trends that you and your family and Unit 42 are seeing.
Nice.
Hack tools, attack frameworks, campaigns, malware families, ransomware stuff.
Nice.
And then the second, since you're working with all this cool stuff and you have dirty hands, I'm sure if they're actually dirty, I thought I could provide some advice to how organizations should be handling.
Nice.
You wrote a book about it, Operationalizing Threat Intelligence,
as
well as threat hunting, which I would assume you mentioned earlier that you do a lot of. So start out there with the trends relating to hacking tools and attack frameworks.
Yeah.
So what are you seeing out there in the wild when it comes to?
So the first thing I wanted to mention about that specifically is that we're seeing a large blending of traditional targeted nation-state backed attackers and cyber criminal tactics and techniques blending together. It's making it more difficult for us as researchers and intelligence individuals to understand who's behind the attacks and to telegraph where that's going to go in the future. So it's something that, from our perspective, that blending of tactics, that blending of techniques is causing more difficulty in understanding and defining, hey, this is group APT34, or hey, this is Trident Ursa, or hey, this is et cetera, and pinpointing exactly where that goes. So that's kind of an overarching trend that's really been shifting over the past few years, realistically, but it's even more so. And the reason that's happening is because of frameworks like Cobalt Strike, because of Sliver, because of Brute Retel, because of these red teaming tools that a lot of individual actors, and it could be targeted state-backed attackers, or it could be ransomware actors, BEC actors, anyone in between. And they're using these types of toolings because A, they're cheap. Cobalt Strike is relatively cheap. Brute Retel is free. or relatively cheap if you really look at it from an operational perspective. Sliver is free, so they're able to access free tools that are highly modular and work well in order to basically go in, exfiltrate data, compromise their systems, etc. And ultimately, that's hard for us again because Cobalt Strike is used by pen testers, Cobalt Strike is used by ransomware operators, Cobalt Strike is used by APT groups, and that's the trending that we're starting to see. And the reason and rationale behind that is, again, it works. It works. It's easy. It doesn't require a lot of technical knowledge to be able to build like a Cobalt Strike payload, as an example. It doesn't require a lot of technical knowledge. And this really all kind of started back like the Metasploit days, back when Metasploit came out and it was free and everybody is like, oh, wow, this is really cool. And we can really do a lot of neat stuff. We can build, encrypted payloads, packed binaries, all these things. And it's migrated into now what we're seeing is, Cobalt Strike, all of these tools being leveraged. So we're seeing that across the board, which is an interesting trend that we're monitoring and kind of continuing to track over time. And it's also difficult to some degree from a detection perspective. Writing detections and signatures for Cobalt Strike payloads and for C2 traffic, et cetera, is a whack-a-mole game. And I say that because Cobalt Strike is constantly changing how they adapt and how they bypass signature-based technologies, how they bypass different types of technology stacks. And it's something that we're watching, with great agility that those particular companies are modifying those tools rapidly to adapt.
When I asked you that question, I expected you to say something like, due to the war or whatever, that the lines between a previously economically focused group and a threat or a state, whatever, a state actor.
Attacker, yeah.
I thought that they would be the same, and then my question was going to be then like, is that only happening like with the Russian, Ukrainian cyber groups, but then I'll say the Chinese or the other.
Yeah, I mean, we're continually seeing a bleed over. And I'll give you an example. We're seeing several APT groups or advanced persistent attack groups leveraging ransomware as one of the methods for them to be able to cause damage and issues inside of victim organizations, government agencies, and everything in between. We've seen it from virtually many of the countries that we track and the groups within those countries that we track, and we're very careful with what we attribute. It takes us a great deal of time to say this group is APT34 as an example. It takes a great deal of time. We have a very structured system and a very structured method for programmatically going through and making sure that we graduate temporary clusters of activity that we've identified into like actor groups, et cetera. But we're really seeing just that blend happen across the board. And again, ransomware is a perfect example where we're seeing these targeted style of attacks actually leverage ransomware. And there's a litany of different reasons as to why that's leveraged, some of which could be a red herring, for instance, trying to throw off incident responders, keep them busy, keeping them thinking that they're possibly running against a cybercrime operation or a ransomware operator or a RAS operator, when in fact their ultimate objective is to actually exfiltrate sensitive information, right? Really so it could be a false flag effort in that case. So we're seeing some of that happen pretty frequently, unfortunately, at this point.
Yeah, unfortunately. Let's see. Attack frameworks, or hack tools, targeted attack campaigns, malware families. When it comes to malware, what's malware like these days? I know there's always new ones. You have these
always
groups
new,
that are
always new stuff. But what we're also seeing, I hate to say this, is, and I feel like this whole week throughout Norway, I've been kind of preaching some of the same things, which is a lot of the old stuff that used to work is still working. And we'll talk about, I'm sure, like common infection vectors that we're seeing and that type of thing. But I'm still seeing a lot of the same old stuff work. And what I mean is we're still seeing a lot of commodity malware. And by commodity malware, I'm referring to things such as like QuackBot, generic info stealers, generic rats, remote access Trojans, those types of things being leveraged by actors because, again, it's blending and making it harder for companies to be able to say, yes, this is that group operating out of this country. It becomes difficult at that point to understand, is that actually targeted intent and is there other activity behind that? So from a malware perspective, we still see a propensity of commodity malware families being leveraged as typically first stage payloads. And what I mean by that is the actor will actually go out and distribute or use this first stage payload as the entry mechanism, with the idea being that then secondarily they'll drop a ransomware family, or secondarily they'll drop an info stealer, or secondary an exfiltration tool. And we'll oftentimes see that that's what they're actually doing with those commodity style malwares. From a custom malware perspective, we're seeing a litany of different things. And what I mean by that is in the past, cyber criminals were, of course, creating their own malware families, their own builders for malware families, et cetera, and for payloads, et cetera. But the difference is that used to not be as advanced as what it is now. We're seeing cybercrime actors specifically and especially in the ransomware field, really start to go above and beyond in how they're developing their actual payloads, et cetera. We didn't really see that a tremendous amount in the past from a cybercrime operation perspective. And again, this all lends back to the fact that we're seeing all of the TTPs, techniques, tactics, and procedures, blending between those two. Again, muddying those waters. We're also seeing targeted state-backed attackers leveraging a lot of their own custom tooling. And that could be everything from lateral access tools all the way down to exfiltration tools. And again, these actors are doing that to fly under the radar, to make it more difficult, and to have custom functionality. We're also seeing the leveraging and the usage of what we would consider modular malware. What I mean by that is the ability for malware authors to add on specific pieces of functionality to the family. So it could be, for instance, we've identified a piece of malware, for instance, and maybe this malware's core functionality is a remote access Trojan, but maybe there's a module that they can very easily plug into that might also sniff operational technology environment traffic, such as like from Modbus or DNP3. And that modularity makes that malware more complex. It makes it more difficult for us to reverse engineer and understand how it functions. And it also makes it difficult for us to understand the full functionality of that tool, because we might see the same sample elsewhere or same similar functioning sample elsewhere, but with different modules attached. So we're like, okay, so it's the same core family. This is a variant based on this module that's been attached to it.
Yeah. So in that specific case you're talking about now, like it could be like an initial access broker gets into an organization, and then they're selling that access, and then somebody will buy that access, and then, okay, just like one of your products, right? Download something from their cloud, I guess, and then just add on the functionality they need.
That's an idea behind it, right? They're typically doing that like on their own systems, meaning that they're developing on their own system, they're generating their own payloads, et cetera. What you're referring to more is kind of the IAB aspect of someone selling access to an environment and saying, for $5, you give me a username and password, and I'll go out and give you access to this password or to this machine. And the victim or the attacker can actually do whatever they want at that point. They can drop ransomware, laterally move. They could target that specific system and exfiltrate emails or offload emails, et cetera, and everything in between. From the modular perspective, it's typically a series of malware authors that are kind of, structuring and building that malware in such a way that allows them that flexibility of having modular frameworks to build out that type of malware. But they're typically doing that in their own development environments. They're not doing that like on the endpoint. They're usually leveraging the modularized malware on the endpoint that's already been compromised, if that makes sense.
Maybe a little out of place in the conversation, but initial access brokers, you also see the mudding in the waters, like initial access brokers actually working with APT groups, or is it still that's more like economically focused?
We don't have a good viewpoint to that aspect so much. So meaning the coordination between an IAB and the actual group itself. Where we have a lot of visibility from that perspective is specifically with ransomware, because IABs and ransomware actors almost always work together, specifically for ransomware as a service operations. And they do that because it allows them a diverse business model while also allowing individuals to focus on specific areas. You have money launderers that their expertise is money laundering. You have experts that are initial access brokers. That allows the malware authors and the operators within the system or within the ransomware as a service ecosystem to not have to focus on initial access. So they don't really care about vulnerabilities that are being popped. They don't really care about low-hanging fruit on externally exposed services. They only care about executing ransomware, exfiltrating data, and ransoming those victims. So it's interesting. It's truly a business model at this point, and a structured business, which is interesting to see.
Yeah, it's not a good thing to see, but
it's really. I've been in this industry for a long time at this point, and it's really, frankly, disheartening to see it change and evolve to be so successful. And that's not even talking about BEC, right? I mean, ransomware is a huge problem. But BEC, from a financial perspective, or business email compromise, is an even bigger problem financially. And I'm sure we can talk about that. But that's something else that is a huge prevalent problem right now.
That surpassed ransomware now, right?
Yeah.
Is that number one then?
From the IC3, which is an organization in the United States. They release figures every year, numbers specifically around how much is lost per ransomware, per BEC, et cetera. And BEC consistently rates above that.
Wow.
If I remember correctly, in 2021, IC3, I believe, said 1.7 billion was lost from BEC, just in the United States, if I'm not mistaken. And that's only increasing every year.
Yeah, happens here as well.
It happens. It's easy. It doesn't require a lot of technical experience. It doesn't require a lot of technical expertise. Someone that can generate a nice spear phishing email that looks native to that speaker's language can go a long way.
Yeah.
And that's where I'm afraid some of the kind of ChatGPT style of things will kind of take over.
I was just thinking that.
Yeah, exactly. It's not necessarily, I don't really see maybe in the future we'll see malware being built with it. And we have seen some examples of POCs of that. But where I foresee it happening first is in really highly crafted spear phishing and phishing emails that are in a user's native language that really looks accurate in order to facilitate stuff like BEC and wire fraud.
Yeah, I've had episodes about BEC before, but it's like, I don't know if this is still the truth, but it's a lot easier to protect against that by teaching your finance department.
User awareness.
Make policies around it. It's a lot harder. It's easier to prevent that than maybe ransomware.
I would tend to agree with that. I would tend to agree with that. And I say that because typically BEC actors, and I say typically, there are outliers, but typically BEC actors are looking to compromise email first.
Yeah, exactly.
And only really we've seen from our own incident response case data at Unit 42 that half of BEC cases are really involving wire fraud, while the other half are involving data exfiltration. Okay. So we're seeing a little bit of a change there that typically BEC attackers would only really focus on financial fraud and getting money. But now we're seeing kind of that change or that bleed over of tactics, techniques, and procedures, maybe even from ransomware actors, because the ransomware actors are kind of known to do that. And we're seeing that kind of blend across the board where BEC attackers are now caring about exfiltrating data. So we're seeing 50% of our cases focused on exfiltrating data, and the other 50% of that involving wire fraud. So, a little bit of a hat tip there that maybe they're evolving their tactics, maybe they're evolving their business model, maybe they're dipping their toes into ransomware, maybe they're working with a ransomware actor, or any of those things could occur, and even more outside of that. But yeah, it's a prevalent problem, and they're continually modifying how they operate and act. Yeah.
But both of those models, one that go for getting you to send me money that's not really mine, or exfiltrating data like that, the data is still coming. It's still email that they're getting that data from, right? The exfiltration, or where else?
No, not sometimes. We're seeing the advancement of BEC attackers and actually compromising endpoints, meaning using email as their entry mechanism. So they might compromise a user's email address or email account. And then they might use that user's email account to message maybe a network administrator and say, hey, I need access to that domain controller. And I also need to modify the group policy object to disable Microsoft Defender. And then the network administrator says, oh, okay, that's so on and so forth. Okay, let's do it. We'll create the account. We'll let you in and have at it. And then they have access to the data. Then they can exfiltrate it.
Oh, wow.
So we're seeing that modification happen. And I think, again, that's just a blending of what we're seeing from all of these different cybercrime, targeted attack ecosystems. It's all just kind of blending together in a weird way, and we have to be very precise with what we track, and that's frankly why we're so careful with how we could do attribution. We're very picky, and we don't, as you've probably noticed, don't make big claims about, oh, this is Iranian group X, or hey, this is Chinese group Y, because it takes so much evidence to show that. That we're very picky with when we say those types of things. We're very cautious with those types of things.
Well, that's good. That means we can actually trust what's coming from your mouth when you're.
I think so. I hope so. Yeah.
No, but it's interesting because that still doesn't change the fact that it's still focused around policy, right? Whether it's to not allow you to send me money, but it's also like, hey, maybe if I call you and say disable group policy or let me uninstall Windows Defender, you should call me. Yeah, right? It's still a policy thing.
That's a great point. It is user awareness and policy driven, right? I mean, at the end of the day, user awareness is one of the first ways to stop a lot of these low-hanging fruit attacks. And that goes in the same way as ransomware. A lot of what we see from a ransomware perspective is compromises based on low-hanging fruit. And what I mean by that is RDP, or remote desktop protocol, being exposed to the internet still. It's 2023 and we're still talking about that. Like, this is stuff I talked about back in 2010, right? Like, why are we still why is RDP still exposed to the internet in any capacity? There are other ways around this. Also, unpatched services. One of the biggest entry vectors that we see for ransomware actors is unpatched SSL VPN devices. So from that perspective, because most organizations will deploy SSL VPN boxes, and they forget about them because it's facilitating remote access, they don't really need to think about it. It's working, it's allowing remote employees to access their internal network, and cool, it's great. But what they're not paying attention to is patching those systems. And ransomware actors specifically are extremely agile in being able to adapt to that and being able to adapt to using POC exploit code that's out there, or proof of concept exploit code that's out there, to be able to pop vulnerabilities that exist in SSL VPN devices. So my recommendations always, when I'm talking to customers, it's still, and we may be jumping ahead a bit here, but it's one of those things that I always recommend. Focus on the basics. Constantly patch. Know where systems are deployed, especially external facing. Disable services and systems that are not being used. Kind of the traditional 2010 kind of recommendations are still really truthful in their practical implementation still. It's really staggering. It feels like I'm still having similar conversations 10 years later.
Yeah, we'll probably have the same conversations 10 years from now, unfortunately.
Yeah, unfortunately, probably.
No, I spoke with a large organization at a conference, and, we're talking about external scanning. Not like attack surface management, literally just scanning what you have and reporting vulnerabilities. Yeah, we're not gonna buy that this time. It was okay. That wasn't about price. What was it about then? No, because we would give the results to the business and they wouldn't do anything about it. They wouldn't
do anything. That's common.
Yeah. Sorry, we're not gonna buy it because we don't have the mandate and we can't force them to do it. So why are we gonna spend money on scanning?
What I've encountered with that particular kind of problem as well is that many organizations will get what I would call vulnerability fatigue. So if you're using like an automated vulnerability scanner, it's going to unearth a lot of things that are really kind of informational in nature, right? So like SMP version 1's enabled. That's a big problem, especially for lateral movement and data exfiltration. But it's one of those things that automated vulnerability scanners can unearth a lot of scan information that may not be relevant. And many organizations don't know how to sift through that data to truly prioritize what vulnerability is the most important based on what service and what types of devices are deployed. And then they also didn't take into consideration where those devices are deployed in their network, right? Is it externally facing? That elevates the risk profile. Is it internally facing? And is it in a segmented network or is it in a flat network? Because those are distinctly different, especially when we're talking about operational technology and SCADA environments, right? Because that we're still seeing a problem in terms of operational technology environments having very flat networks. So being able to pivot from a business-based device like an HR system, a finance system, something owned by maybe a network engineer, and being able to pop over into a PLC, an HMI, a data historian, and all on a flat network, all in the same RFC 1918 space or just a related RFC 1918 space. Yeah.
And I mean, even if they were to do all that right, the best security team that can help them prioritize, you still might have a person there and it's like, I don't have time for that. You talk to my boss.
Absolutely.
And that boss doesn't want to talk to them. And
absolutely. Yeah, politics will always come
into
play.
That has not changed.
That hasn't changed. Politics won't go away.
No, exactly.
And patching, and having, that's a dedicated, several folks typically are dedicated to just doing patch management, understanding asset identification, asset management, all of that is an entire position in and of itself. Right? And I don't think a lot of organizations really put enough thought into just that as a function, in my opinion. And we continually see that. And I have that feeling just simply based on the simple fact of what vulnerabilities are still being exploited, some of which are years old at this point.
Yeah, I see that in a lot of tender documents now that they want their SOC vendor to actually push their infrastructure vendor because they don't want to have to deal with themselves, but they make that contract in both. And so then maybe it gets solved through a contract. So.
It very well might, yeah.
Let's see. Office 365, before we go on from trends, what are you seeing around Office 365?
Yeah, a lot of BEC, obviously. We're seeing, actors use Office 365 in a litany of different ways, but actors are really targeting Office 365 for obvious reasons, email being the biggest target from that perspective. We're seeing OneNote attachments being leveraged constantly, specifically from a malware family called Emotet. It's an old school malware family that's been around. They constantly go dark. Law enforcement always gets involved, but never really cuts the head off the snake. They only cut off small pieces. So they constantly come back. And we've been recently watching Emotet leverage OneNote attachments, et cetera, to be able to continue to propagate. So I think it's really a platform that's not only targeted, but also leveraged in capacity to be able to distribute malware, et cetera.
Emotet's probably one that's stuck around the longest,
It's
right?
old. It's really old. And they have had law enforcement involvement. I don't even remember how many times, maybe 2 or 3 times at this point. And they've come back again. They're back once again. But Interpol has really been strong in getting involved and trying to shut down individuals. But it's much, it's a very interesting group in that the folks that are driving the development, the usage of Emotet, it's hard to be able to track those individuals specifically. Yeah.
So trends, I'll leave it there for now. You can go check out the Unit 42 blog, I assume, for all the trends that you want to
absolutely, yeah. It's a great
dive
spot.
into.
It's a great spot.
Operationalizing Threat Intelligence.
Yeah, subject near and dear to my heart.
Yeah. So I have a lot of, a lot of clients that are saying, we're kind of past the, the feeds discussion now. It's like, okay, help me make sense of tell me what's actually important to do with this data.
Yeah, what do we do with this data, right?
Yeah.
And myself and my co-author, Joe Opacki, we decided to write a book. One thing that we were noticing when talking to customers, when just generally in the industry, is that threat intelligence was always talked about, but it was almost always talked about from a military perspective, an intelligence, like government intelligence perspective, et cetera. And there was never really any focal point on how intelligence can be leveraged cheaply inside of organizations.
Very academic, right?
It is. The concept behind it is, but the book we tried to kind of not keep as academic because we're really trying to strike a fine balance of targeting individuals that want to stand up a threat intelligence operation in their organization. It could be the SOC, it could be under their forensics division, it could be anywhere, right? But at the end of the day, we wanted to be able to facilitate being able to give information to these individuals to stand this function up and do it cheaply. Because my whole thing was, and Joe's whole thing was, you can spend $100,000 on tooling, you can spend $500,000 on tooling, but at the end of the day, is there anything that these teams that are new can do to actually kind of approach intelligence and what to do with it? So we wrote the book with the purpose of kind of walking through all of that. And then we also go through the entire intelligence lifecycle and mapping what organizations can do from the planning and direction phase all the way down to the production of that intelligence. As an example, we walk through an entire case study. The last 2 chapters of the book walks through an entire case study from the fact of identifying a malware family, here's the hash, all the way down to here's a report of what that activity had done. And we kind of go through that with the viewpoint of maybe being like an incident responder or a forensic analyst, because that's typically where we see a lot of early on threat intelligence functions live, is in a SOC or in kind of an incident response function. So that was the guise or the viewpoint that we kind of took it through, even though you could apply it elsewhere throughout the organization. It's one of those things that, it was something that we missed and that we weren't seeing, or that we were seeing a gap in books across the board. And I think we filled a very distinct niche from a corporate perspective, which I think as well. And then we also talk about how to mature threat intelligence programs, how to mature threat hunting, how you can actually do, from clustering and activity analysis, and how you cluster actor activity based on artifacts from infrastructure, based on artifacts from malware families, like mutexes, PDB paths, those types of things, or who is records, passive DNS, hosting history, all of the stuff associated with infrastructure, and then how to cluster that activity together. So we also dive into the kind of mentality of a threat intelligence researcher to give you a little bit of a viewpoint as to what can you actually do with this data, because hunting and pivoting is neat, and it tells a neat and flashy story, but what is it practically that organizations can do with that data? Like, if they have an intelligence person that's doing hunting and pivoting and they're finding related activity, et cetera, what are they doing with that at the end of the day? They need to be blocking, alerting on that activity that they're finding that's related. And that's why we try to connect those dots.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I would assume that there's a big difference. I have 2 customers in my head. One of them is like very large and has enough people to actually do that sort of like, okay, they're actually able to, this is an incident, we can actually predict, we have like we think that they're going to try to do this because we're seeing that's here, right?
Yep.
And then you have the smaller companies that are just kind of like, I'm buying threat intelligence so I can use it to get a budget.
Yeah.
Like, okay, here, look at all these attacks happening here, and can I please have this much money? So like, where's the...
Well, there's something that I like to kind of, that I look at whenever I go into an organization, and I try to use something that's called the threat intelligence maturity model. And it's, I believe, a 5-step process, 5-step model that you can rate where an organization sits in terms of their threat intelligence maturity and where they rate from a hunting perspective. So like a level 0, for instance, would be an organization that does manual threat hunting. They might ingest a few feeds from like a blacklist feed or a malware feed, something like that. And then they just do alerting based on that, one-to-one. And then if we go all the way to the end of the spectrum, the most mature organizations, they're the ones that are doing exactly what you're referring to, doing clustering, doing proactive identification or hypothesis generation based on what you're seeing now and where that's likely to go in the future. That would be one of the more mature organizations. And then rating in between, or all of the steps in between, or all the maturity steps in between will vary. So like the maturity goes up as you go down that path.
Yeah.
So oftentimes as I'm talking to organizations, I'm trying to picture where they would fit in that maturity model, because that tells you also what they need to do to mature to the next level, meaning what they need to do. Do they need to implement systems? Do they need to implement processes? Do they need to hire headcount? What do they need to do in order to mature? And that's really where I start to think through when I'm talking to organizations.
Interesting, yeah. And what is that? You say process. What do you mean by process? I mean, headcount's easy because then you have more people to do more things, right? But
one perfect example is, let's say you have a threat intelligence platform, and that's basically one centralized system that's intended to store all intelligence data. And that could be data or contextualized intelligence. And I can talk about the distinct difference between those two. But let's say that we have a tip, and we have 5 analysts that are manually entering information into that tip. A process enhancement that would make an organization go from one tier to the next would be automating pivots, as an example. So let's say we have a URL, and we want to see passive DNS on that URL or that domain. We could then go out and automatically pull that data and enrich that without having a human even do that. And that's automated. So that way when the analyst, so when the analyst clicks on the domain, they'll be able to see all of the information that in the past, an analyst would manually have to go out and enrich. And having all of that done automatically, that would be one step towards maturing that model. Having the automated pivoting, automatic enrichment, automatic analysis. It's pulling in the context that you need and basically mirroring and marrying all of that data together.
Saving you time at the end of the day.
Saving you time at the end of the day, and saving you the necessity of having to have a bunch of analysts manually do the enrichment.
That also saves you headcount as well.
Headcount.
So a lot of these things are probably intercorrelated. All these
they are. And now, since I've moved into the leadership position at Palo, now I think more in that way, because I'm like, okay, how can we make this more efficient? What do we need to do in order to make analysis faster? What do we need to do in order to make sure production is faster? So that's where I start to think through is, okay, what can we do to cut down analyst time on doing the manual tasks that frankly kind of suck?
So you've been kind of implementing for, XOR, the Cortex?
XOR?
You've been pretty much implementing that frame or way of thinking into everything you have.
In a
automated way, if it's automatable.
We use XOR extensively in our team to do a lot of the manual heavy lifting. So a lot of the enrichments that I was referring to, from a malware hash, for instance, going out to virus total, pulling down any of the information related to a malware hash. That could be everything from a PDB path to a mutex that's generated. And it pulls all of that information dynamically for us and structures it, normalizes it, gives it to us in a rational way. And that's the power behind XOR. And I don't want to, I'm not a product person, but it is one of the tools that has truly revolutionized how we do a lot of that manual lifting, a lot of the manual analysis. XOR does a lot of that for us, and it's extremely easy to use. You don't have to be an expert in coding. You don't have to be a master in Python. It's extremely good in the way that it's implemented.
And it allows people working with it to actually work with the fun stuff, right?
Absolutely.
Instead of having to do because that's usually the way people...
It allows us as researchers to focus on the needles and haystacks. The stuff that the stuff that's highly targeted, the stuff that's extremely interesting, the stuff that really needs to have hands-on looking at it to really understand and develop the protections for that. And that allows us to really focus our points there, as opposed to a lot of the noise that's out there with like Quackbot and these other commodity-style malware.
So where, besides reading your book, is there any place, like if you're operationalizing threat intelligence, is there any good places to start? We'll just leave it at your book, maybe.
I hate to say this, but I think the book is a good starting point because it gives you, it's kind of, gives you a lot of information about a lot of different concepts, and you can dive into each of them in more detail depending upon where you're at and what you're interested in.
Right.
And the motivation of your threat intelligence program, right? Because from our perspective and from, typically in like a product-based organization, threat intelligence has a different function than threat intelligence that's in an organization. Threat intelligence in an organization is typically trying to find activity that isn't being found by products. So they're generating hypotheses for what to hunt on. So they might be saying, well, I know that, we have OWA exposed externally. So emails may be a vector for entry. So let's hunt for, whatever the case is.
Threat hunting. Was that, they're not two different books. They're the same book.
Same book.
Yeah. So what's threat hunting anno 23?
Yeah, so threat hunting, as I mentioned, it differs from a product perspective versus an organizational perspective. Many organizations will leverage threat hunting, again, to hunt for anomalies on their network. And they have dedicated resources, at least some of the more mature organizations, have dedicated resources that will go out and their sole time is dedicated to focusing and hunting across the network environment, hunting through logs, hunting through their SIM, hunting through all of the different endpoints, and looking for anomalous activity. In fact, that's really where I started my career in threat intelligence, was really doing that for companies. Is looking through those logs, trying to find needles in haystacks. And that's where you start to, kind of go through the hypothesis aspects. But that requires a deep understanding of the network, a deep understanding of what's deployed. That way you know what to hunt on. And you also then would understand vulnerability profiles. So maybe, you're running RDP externally, et cetera, and then that allows you to target your hunts. From a product perspective, we would view this more as applied hunting or research hunting. And that's hunting, yes, based on a hypothesis, but it's also hunting based on what we've seen in the past. Meaning if we're wanting to target and focus on looking at one specific actor group that's really impactful, then we can go out and focus on that group and say, this is what we believe they're going to be doing, and let's hunt for these specific things based on what we've seen in the past.
Sort of thing.
In a way. The thought process is similar. Yeah. The methodology for doing it is different, but the thought process is similar. It kind of requires that thought. Yeah.
It's weird because there's a lot of clients out there that are like, we want third-party assistance with threat hunting, which is okay, I get it.
Yeah.
But if you, back to what you were saying, if you need to know like what you have deployed and what's vulnerable and stuff, you kind of, I guess that you could hire an external party to help you with that process, I guess. That's probably what they're asking for.
Most organizations, and we have our own MTH and MDR service. So we have our own managed threat hunting service and our own managed detection response service. As part of those systems and programs, it does become, it comes with that as familiarity of the environment. Because those work hand in hand. But the nice thing about those types of services is if you have no experience, if you have no expertise, if you have no one that understands how to review and deploy snort signatures as an example, these teams can help kind of be a force multiplier like immediately for that stuff because they know what to look for. They know who the most prevalent actors are targeting this industry as an example. So they kind of know generically where to start hunting with because they can say, this is financial industry. X, Y, and Z are prevalent typically in this industry. Let's start there and just see what we can find. And if we don't find anything, let's continue to alter and hone in our hypotheses and just continue to go on from there.
I guess, research, and I know nobody can really answer this question, but the elephant in the room, I'm not sure if you were RSA, AI
I wasn't.
stuff. What are you expecting if you had to put, like, what do you think we're going to be?
I think the first step in evolution is, in my opinion, leveraging something like a GPT model, ChatGPT, something along those lines, to, again, craft very targeted and very accurate phishing and spear phishing messages as the initial entry vector. I don't envision a place where ChatGPT, as an example, and I'm only using that as an example because everyone understands it or knows about it. There have been POC case studies where individuals have used ChatGPT to write malware, but it's been pieced together.
Yeah, because you can't ask them like that.
Yeah, right, exactly. You can't say, hey, write me a piece of malware that does X, Y, and Z. So instead, they'll piece it together and they'll try to finesse it in ChatGPT. There's 2 different published reports about this, and they're both very interesting, and it's really interesting research. And I'm not saying that won't be leveraged in the future, but I see the first step as low-level actors adopting it to more craft and target their spear phishing attacks. I haven't seen evidence of that yet because it's extremely difficult to say, yes, they use ChatGPT. But from our perspective... right. But what we can say is Group X, as an example, in the past has been horribly inaccurate from an English language perspective, as an example. But now, 6 months later, these spear phishing emails are perfect. So maybe they are using something such as that to help them iron out their templates.
Interesting. Yeah, I had I'm in the board of ISACA here in Norway, and we had a presentation where a guy, he didn't say one word. He just used ChatGPT to get them to write that code for him, right? I forgot the example I was using, but if he was actually going to use that, he'd have to use a lot of time putting it together.
Exactly. You have to take time to finesse it, put it together, piece it together. And frankly, it does require programming experience. It does require an understanding of Windows internals or whatever operating system you're targeting, the internals. So it's not like ChatGPT can just spit out a binary for you, like a compiled executable to go run. You have to know how to piece those together. You have to know how to, compile it and make sure it all works.
Yeah, of course. So my last question is like, I know you're not on the product side, and we're not trying to sell anything in here anyway, but I would assume that all the vendors are going to start adding GPT-like functions to their products, so you can ask it a question. A security copilot is an example of that. I haven't seen too many other vendors come out yet, but would you also agree that's going to be?
I think that will be huge, and I say that I think in the future, leveraging a model such as that to be able to answer and troubleshoot and also to do some generic log analysis will be very beneficial. And what I mean is the same way we're kind of leveraging XOR right now. and that we're kind of leveraging it to do some of that manual heavy lifting that we don't like to do as analysts. I can foresee that shifting to models in the future that can help accomplish some of that. Initial log reviews, for instance, generic port scans, that kind of stuff. Filter out all port scan information because I don't really care about that. That kind of stuff, I think could be a huge force multiplier, specifically for defenders, incident responders, forensic analysts, intelligence individuals, etc. Palo Alto Networks is doing a lot of work in that area, and there's been a tremendous amount of push to make sure that every team is innovating in those areas and leveraging it to its full capacity.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, no, we were discussing it too. Our research team was talking about it. They're like, I mean, we could technically run that on our, because we have a bunch of data. Yeah. But we'd have to have more hardware. It was like it's like $1 million a day in hardware for us to do that. Right. But I'm guessing that's probably what. That's maybe the investment you have to make to be able to.
It's definitely a cost. There's no doubt about it that it takes investment. I mean, to run the services that are required for that and the processing is expensive. There's no way around that. Yeah. And that's why I think you'll see the larger organizations, Palo Alto Networks included, being some of the innovators in that front, because we have very large data pool. We have a lot of resources at our expenditure from big computing perspective, et cetera. So I can foresee that, playing out a lot in the future.
Good things you're best friends with Google. So that works out.
That has been beneficial. Yeah.
Mr. Wilhoit, it's been a pleasure.
Likewise. It's been a pleasure.
It's been the quickest 50 minutes of my life. So thank you very much for your time. And looking forward to speaking to you next time.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Cool.